Hello students, this will be covalent nomenclature. Sometimes it's called molecular nomenclature. This is the naming of chemical compounds, particularly nonmetals to nonmetals. So if you're not sure if an element is a nonmetal or a metal, just use your periodic table. On your periodic table, your metals and your nonmetals are in their own location. Hydrogen is your first nonmetal. It's over there by itself in the corner. Then your other nonmetals, if you look at boron and carbon and you draw a line between them and then you make a staircase going down and to the right, you can separate your metals and your nonmetals. Everything to the right of the staircase is a nonmetal. Everything to the left of the staircase, except for hydrogen, is a metal. So if you got two elements in the compound and they're both on the right side of that staircase, then you're dealing with a covalent compound. So you use covalent nomenclature rules. So those rules are pretty simple. The first rule is the first element keeps its own name. So if you see CO2, C is carbon, so carbon will remain carbon. It might get a prefix if there's a subscript on it, but for the most part, it's going to keep its own name. The second element changes to IDE on the ending. So if I had sulfur as the second element of my compound, I would change sulfur to sulfide. If phosphorus was my second element, I would change it to phosphide. Oxygen changes to oxide. Iodine changes to iodide. Bromine changes to bromide. And nitrogen changes to nitride. So all we're doing there is changing the ending to IDE. Then you'll also see subscripts or numbers beside each letter. Those subscripts tell you how many atoms of that element are in the compound. And so you want to indicate that with the nomenclature as well. If there is no number, then it's understood to be 1, and we name 1 with mono. Now mono only goes for the second element. We don't put it on the first element. 2 will be di, 3 is tri, 4 is tetra, 5 is penta, 6 hexa, 7 hepta, 8 octa, and then you might see 9 and 10, you might not, but if you don't know their prefixes, there those are. So there's your rules. Pretty straightforward, pretty simple. So there's your 3 rules that you need to keep in mind as you're doing your nomenclature. The first element keeps its own name. The second element changes to IDE, and if there's any numbers, give them a prefix. 2 other things you want to keep in mind as you're doing your nomenclature is if you have AO or OO put together, you want to just shorten it to O. And as I said earlier, if you have a 1 on the first element, you do not have to name mono. That's mostly for the second element. So let's look at some examples. CO2. C is carbon. There's no number here, so I don't need to use mono even though it's understood to be 1. I call carbon, carbon. First element keeps its own name. The next element is oxygen, and it has a 2 on it. Since it has a 2, I go ahead and put di, and oxygen changes to oxide. Remember, the second element ends in IDE, so oxygen changes to oxide. So CO2 is carbon dioxide. Next we got NO2. N is nitrogen. No need for mono. O2. O is oxygen. 2 is di, so I put dioxide. The ending changes to IDE. Next one I got CCl4. Make sure you don't mistake this for carbon and iodine. Cl is chlorine. So carbon stays carbon. Chlorine changes to chloride, and I have a 4. So that's tetra. So it's carbon tetrachloride. Next up, P4O6. P is phosphorus, 4 is tetra, so it's tetra phosphorus. O6 is hexa oxide. Now remember, this is an A and an O put together. If we have an A and an O put together, we shorten it to just O. So instead of hexaoxide, it's just going to be hexoxide. So hex oxide. Next up, H2O. Everybody should know what H2O is, but it does have a proper name. So H2O is dihydrogen monoxide. Now you don't put monooxide because that would be OO put together. It's just monoxide. Next is CH4. So that's carbon, tetrahydride. Next up, CO. That's carbon monoxide. And I did drop an O since it was monooxide. I changed it to just monoxide. I just used one O instead of two. And the last one is N2O3. So 2 is di, N is nitrogen, O3 is trioxide. And that's it for covalent nomenclature. So if it's on the right side of the staircase, it's a nonmetal. And don't forget about hydrogen. It's a nonmetal as well. Then you got your 3 rules. The first element keeps its own name. The second element ends with IDE. Subscripts are named with prefixes. If you can remember those 3 rules and how to determine if it's a metal or a nonmetal, you shouldn't miss any covalent nomenclature problems. Hope this helps you, and good luck on your tests.